Hello, wizards and muggles. Welcome back to our magical channel. Today we're going to dive into one of the most fascinating, dark and deeply moving stories in the Harry Potter universe, the complete history of the Deathly Hallows. Prepare yourselves for an epic journey that goes far beyond what you imagine. A saga that spans more than 1,000 years of magical history. From ancestral legends to the events that forever changed the destiny of the world we know and love. Before we begin this extraordinary adventure, if you're not yet part of our magical family, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know our wizards and muggles scattered around the world. The story I'll share today isn't just a legend told in storybooks. It's an epic saga of absolute power, inevitable death, love that transcends dimensions, and sacrifices that defined generations. From the skilled hands of the mysterious Peverell brothers to the final confrontation between Harry Potter and Voldemort, the Deathly Hallows are the golden thread that connects more than 1,000 years of magical history. A narrative that few know completely, but which shaped the destiny of us all. Our epic journey begins more than 1,000 years ago, in an era when magic still pulsed wild through the earth, and the boundaries between life and death were much more tenuous. It was an era of prodigies and terrors, where the impossible happened daily, and wizards shaped reality with powers that today we would consider divine. In this extraordinary time lived three brothers who would become legendary: Antioch, Cadmus, and Ignotus Peverell. But don't be mistaken. They weren't common wizards walking the dusty roads of medieval England. They were true archmages, masters of magical arts so profound and dangerous that today they would be considered not just impossible, but absolutely terrifying for any modern wizard. The legend we know, immortalized in The Tale of the Three Brothers by Beedle the Bard, transports us to a dark night where these three prodigies traveled along a road known for its tragedies. The path serpentined through cursed lands, where whispers of lost travelers echoed among ancient trees, and many who dared to pass never returned to their homes. When they reached the treacherous river, its black waters known for swallowing lives for centuries, the Peverells didn't hesitate. With enchantments that made nature itself bow to their will, they raised a magical bridge over the deadly waters. But in the middle of the crossing, when they already felt safe, an icy presence enveloped them. It was Death himself in person. Imagine, if you can, the most terrifying figure your minds can conceive. An entity wrapped in eternal shadows, with eyes that have seen the end of all things, and a voice that echoes like the last breath of those who depart forever. Death was furious. Those waters had been his harvesting tool for millennia, and the three brothers had just deprived him of 3 new souls. But Death was ancient and cunning. Instead of attacking directly, he feigned admiration for the brothers' exceptional skill. With a smile that froze the blood, he offered them each a gift as a reward for their intelligence. The three brothers, each with their own nature and desires, made choices that would echo through the centuries. Antioch, the eldest of the three, possessed a heart that pulsed with thirst for power and domination. He was a born duelist, known throughout the magical world not only for his incomparable skill, but for his arrogance that rivaled the ancient gods. His eyes gleamed with ambition when he saw the opportunity before him. "I want a wand more powerful than any other in existence," he declared without hesitation. "A wand that makes its bearer invincible in any duel, capable of defeating any opponent who dares oppose me." Death smiled sinisterly. He knew exactly what that gift would bring. From an ancestral elder branch that grew on the riverbank, he molded the Elder Wand with his own spectral hands. This wasn't a common wand like those we know in Ollivander's shops or anywhere else in the magical world. Made from sacred elderwood, a tree that, according to legends, only flowers where the blood of the righteous has been spilled, and with a core of thestral tail hair. Creatures that can only be seen by those who have witnessed death up close. It was a wand born from the very essence of mortality. The powers of the Elder Wand defied the natural laws of magic in ways that even today scholars cannot fully explain. It could repair other wands considered irreparable. A feat that is normally impossible. It performed magic that would require dozens of experienced wizards working in unison. And in the right hands, legends whispered, it could even touch the veil between life and death in ways no wizard had ever dared dream. Antioch returned to his village completely intoxicated by the power he now possessed. The wand seemed to whisper in his mind, feeding his natural arrogance with promises of eternal glory. That very fateful night, he sought out a rival wizard with whom he had ancient, bloody disagreements, a man who had publicly humiliated Antioch years before. The duel was brutal, but frighteningly quick. The Elder Wand cut through the opponent's most elaborate defenses, like an incandescent blade through parchment. Antioch won with an ease that left him stunned, completely destroying his rival with a single devastating curse that left a smoking crater where once there had been a man. That night, while he slept heavily, an envious and desperately ambitious wizard silently infiltrated his room. With a poisoned blade, he cut Antioch's throat and stole the wand that would be his downfall. Thus, through his own arrogance, death took Antioch. Cadmus, the middle brother, possessed a completely different heart. Where Antioch sought power over others, Cadmus sought only to reunite with those he had lost. He had recently lost the woman he loved more than life itself, a young witch of indescribable beauty named Ilara, who died of a mysterious illness just 3 days before their wedding. Imagine the pain that gnawed at Cadmus day and night. He could hear her laughter echoing through the empty corridors of his house. He could smell her perfume on clothes she would never wear again. Each dawn was a new stab, reminding him that she wouldn't be there to share another day. Consumed by pain that seemed to tear his very soul, Cadmus addressed death with tears streaming down his face. Bring her back to me. Give me the power to reunite with those who have departed. I cannot live in this world without her. Death, with his cruel smile that had deceived countless souls through millennia, took a stone from the river's depths, a black stone like hopelessness that had been polished by the tears of 1,000 widowers. With magic older than the stars themselves, he transformed it into the Resurrection Stone, engraving on it a symbol that would become both sacred and cursed, a perfect circle within a triangle, cut by a vertical line. Cadmus ran home with his heart racing with hope and despair mixed together. Unable to wait even one more second, he turned the stone 3 times in his trembling hand, whispering Ilara's name like a prayer. And she appeared. She was there, yes, but not as Cadmus remembered. It was as if a thin and insurmountable film eternally separated her from the world of the living. Her eyes, which once shone with joy, now carried infinite sadness. Her skin, which once radiated warmth, now had the pallor of the moon on a winter night. When Cadmus tried to touch her, his hands passed through her like mist. When he spoke of his love, she only shook her head with an expression of deep pain. Ilara was suffering, torn by force from the eternal rest she deserved, forced to exist between 2 worlds without truly belonging to either. "Why did you bring me back?" she whispered with a voice that sounded like wind through dead leaves. "I was at peace, my love, I was at peace." Cadmus then realized the terrible truth that death had hidden. The dead should never return to the world of the living. They belonged to the beyond, and bringing them back was a cruel form of torture for both them and those who loved them. The Resurrection Stone didn't offer true reunion, only a cruel imitation that made the loss even more painful. Consumed by devastating guilt and absolute despair, unable to be truly with his beloved, but also unable to let her go again, Cadmus hanged himself in his own house that same night. using the rope he had planned to use to decorate the garden for the wedding that never happened. Thus, through love that became obsession, death took Cadmus. Ignotus, the youngest but by far the wisest of the three brothers, observed his brother's choices with growing unease. He possessed a sharp perception that allowed him to see through the masks people wore, and from the first moment he deeply distrusted Death's true intentions. When his turn came, Ignotus didn't ask for power over others or impossible attempts to reverse the natural. Instead, with the wisdom that comes from truly understanding the nature of things, he made an apparently simple but profoundly intelligent request. "I want something that allows me to leave this place without being followed, neither by you nor by anyone who wishes me harm." Death hesitated for the first time. This request was different, more prudent, harder to turn into a curse. Reluctant, but bound by his given word, he removed his own personal cloak, a mantle woven with the darkness of the void between stars, and handed it to Ignotus with visible resentment. The invisibility cloak wasn't like other magical cloaks that existed throughout the world. It was a truly impenetrable mantle which hid its user not only from common sight, but from detection spells, from ancestral magical creatures, and even from Death's own supernatural senses. It was invisibility in its purest and most absolute form. Ignotus lived a long, prosperous, and mainly happy life. He married a wonderful witch who loved his gentle and wise nature. He had children who grew up under his loving guidance, learning not only magic, but wisdom about when to use it and when to abstain. When he finally felt that his natural hour had come, not from illness or violence, but simply because he had lived a full life, he passed the sacred cloak to his eldest son with instructions about its responsible use. Only then, like an old friend meeting another after a long journey, he greeted Death as an equal and voluntarily departed with him to whatever existed beyond this life. Thus, through wisdom and humility, Ignotus not only cheated Death, he taught him about the value of a life well lived. When the three extraordinary brothers died, their impossible creations took completely different paths through the torrent of history. Each relic carried not only magical power, but also the essence and personality of its creator, destining them to influence the world in completely distinct ways. The Elder Wand began its bloody and relentless journey through the centuries, passing violently from murderous wizard to murderous wizard in an endless chain of death and betrayal. It was as if Antioch's ambition had been infused into the very wood, forcing it to always seek bearers who shared his thirst for power and domination. The resurrection stone mysteriously disappeared after Cadmus's tragic death, carrying with it the pain and despair that had consumed its creator. It would resurface centuries later, secretly transformed into a gaunt family ring, continuing to spread sadness and obsession wherever it went. The invisibility cloak, reflecting Ignotus's wisdom and benevolence, remained protected and honored in the Peveril family, being passed lovingly from generation to generation as a sacred inheritance. Not an object of power to be conquered, but a gift to be preserved and used responsibly. After violently stealing the wand from Antioch Peveril's still warm corpse, the unknown assassin quickly discovered he had obtained much more than he had bargained for. The wand wasn't just an object of power. It seemed to have developed a consciousness of its own, an insatiable thirst for conflict that attracted violence wherever it went. During the centuries that followed, a terrible and predictable pattern established itself. The wand's bearer would gain unimaginable power, but that same power would inevitably attract increasingly desperate and dangerous challenges. Within months, or at best a few years, the bearer would be defeated by someone even more ambitious, who in turn would suffer the same fate. The wand created a vicious cycle that fed on human nature itself. The more power it offered, the more envy and ambition it awakened in others. It was a curse disguised as a blessing, a gift that always demanded a terrible final price. One of the first bearers officially documented by historical records was an absolutely terrifying dark wizard known only as Loxias, who spread terror throughout magical Europe in the early 14th century. His story is told in whispers to this day, a cautionary tale about how absolute power can transform even a talented wizard into an unimaginable monster. Loxias wasn't evil by nature when young. Fragmentary records suggest he began as an idealistic wizard, someone who genuinely believed he could use superior power to create a better world. But the Elder Wand was like poison in his veins, gradually amplifying his worst impulses until his original compassion transformed into systematic cruelty. With the wand in his hands, Loxias methodically built an empire of terror that extended from the mountains of Scotland to the forests of Germany. He didn't just subjugate magical communities through fear, he completely reorganized them according to his distorted vision of perfection. Entire families disappeared during the night. Wizards who questioned his decisions were transformed into horrible examples for others. What made Loxias particularly terrifying wasn't just his cruelty, but his intelligence. He developed elaborate systems of control, spy networks that infiltrated all communities under his dominion. The Elder Wand allowed him to perform feats that seemed impossible. He could appear simultaneously in various places through magical projections, read minds at enormous distances, and create curses that persisted for generations. His bloody reign lasted almost a complete decade, a period that historians still study with horror and fascination. During this time, it's estimated that thousands of wizards lost their lives directly or indirectly because of his tyrannical policies. Loxias's end finally came through Arcus, a brave young wizard who had lost his entire family to Loxias's purges. Arcus dedicated years to meticulously planning his revenge, studying every aspect of Loxias's magic until he found a single vulnerability. The final battle was truly epic, a confrontation that completely destroyed an entire medieval castle and killed dozens of people in the process. Loxias fought with the fury of someone who had never faced real opposition, while Arcus fought with the silent desperation of one who had nothing left to lose. When the smoke finally cleared, Arcus emerged victorious, but victory came at a terrible price. The absurd amount of dark magic released during combat aged him physically several decades in a matter of minutes. His hair darkened and then whitened. His skin wrinkled like ancient parchment, and his eyes gained the haunted depth of someone who had seen too much suffering. Arcus, traumatized not only by the battle, but by intimate knowledge of what the wand had done to Loxias, courageously tried to break the cycle of violence. He genuinely believed he could use the wand for benevolent purposes, healing, protection, reconstruction of communities devastated by years of terror. But he quickly discovered that the Elder Wand actively resisted benevolent magic. It was as if it had been forged specifically to dominate, conquer, and destroy. Worse still, mere possession of the wand had marked Arcus as a target. During his troubled reign, the entire magical world entered what historians today call the period of silent wars, decades of bloody conflicts between different factions of dark wizards, all desperately trying to conquer the legendary wand. Arcus spent the last years of his life not governing or enjoying power, but constantly running. He developed justified paranoia, always looking nervously over his shoulders, always expecting the next assassin who would inevitably come. He slept with alarm spells around his bed, ate only food he prepared himself, and trusted very few people. Ironically, his death came not through an epic duel or magical battle, but from something much more mundane and terrible. In 1362, a particularly intelligent witch named Livius poisoned him during what he believed to be a peace negotiation. She had realized that the wand, however powerful, couldn't protect its bearer from all forms of death, only from magical ones. The centuries that followed saw the legendary wand pass through the hands of some of the darkest, cruelest, and genuinely disturbed wizards in all documented history. Each left their indelible mark on world magical history, and each contributed to the growing legend of curse that surrounded the wand. Godolo the Scholar was perhaps the most intellectual and systematically dangerous of all bearers. Unlike the tyrants who came before, Godolo wasn't interested in political power or territorial domination. He wanted knowledge, specifically knowledge about the true nature of magic that the wand made possible. During his time as bearer, Godolo conducted experiments that today would be considered not just illegal, but fundamentally immoral. He systematically tested the limits of the wand's power, using voluntary and involuntary prisoners as test subjects. His writings, preserved in his sinister grimoire, Secrets of the Darkest Arts, reveal a brilliant mind, but completely disconnected from human compassion. Godolo discovered that the wand could perform magic that would normally require dozens of experienced wizards working together. It could penetrate defenses considered absolutely impenetrable. More disturbing, he documented evidence that the wand possessed a rudimentary form of consciousness. It seemed to anticipate its bearer's desires and occasionally suggest actions that would amplify conflict and violence. Ironically, Godolo's obsession with understanding the wand led to his destruction. His own son, Hereward, grew up observing the horrible transformations that power had caused in his father. When Hereward reached adulthood, he made a terrible but understandable decision. He locked Godolo in his own secret laboratory and left him to die slowly of hunger and thirst. Hereward publicly claimed he was freeing the world from a dangerous monster and was probably being sincere. But the more complex truth was that he also wanted the wand for himself, believing he could resist the temptations that had corrupted his father. Hereward, the guilty, lasted only a few pathetic months as legitimate bearer. The devastating guilt of having murdered his own father, even for understandable reasons, consumed him completely. He made basic tactical mistakes, lost focus during duels, and was eventually defeated with humiliating ease by Barnabas Deverell, an experienced wizard who had patiently waited for his opportunity. Deverell was possibly the cruelest, most sadistic, and genuinely psychopathic of all Elder Wand bearers in all documented history. He affectionately called it the Death Stick, and developed an almost romantic relationship with the violence it made possible. During his reign of terror in the 17th century, Deverell personally murdered hundreds of people, not in fair battles or purposeful wars, but for pure sadistic pleasure. He developed execution techniques that were works of macabre art, transforming murder into theatrical performance. Deverell created completely revolutionary dueling techniques that specifically exploited the wand's unique powers. He could cast multiple killing curses simultaneously against various opponents, create magical shields that absorbed and redirected enemy spells back to their casters, and perform public executions that became legendary for their creative cruelty and sadistic originality. What made Deverell particularly terrifying was his cold and calculating intelligence. He didn't kill from anger or impulse. Each murder was carefully planned as a lesson or entertainment. He created a magical amphitheater where he forced other wizards to duel to the death for his amusement, transforming human tragedy into spectacle. His deserved end finally came in 1689, when a courageous group of aurors led by Egbert the Bold managed to corner him after months of meticulous planning. Egbert had lost his youngest son to one of Deverell's performances and dedicated his life to revenge. The final battle lasted 3 entire days, devastating an area of several miles around. Egbert didn't try to disarm him honorably. He had learned that honor had no place when it came to stopping a monster like Deverell. Instead, he used a tactic that would become famous. He attacked Deverell cowardly from behind, while he was distracted torturing an innocent victim. For endless centuries, the Elder Wand passed violently from hand to hand, always leaving a bloody trail of death and destruction. Each bearer added their own mark of horror to the growing legend, but all were fundamentally small in scale. Local tyrants, individual assassins, regional despots. But in the 20th century, the wand finally found its most dangerous, intelligent, and truly threatening bearer to all humanity, Gellert Grindelwald. Grindelwald wasn't just magically powerful, he possessed something much more dangerous than raw power: vision. He was brilliant, charismatic, deeply convinced of his beliefs, and possessed a clear and apparently logical ideology for the future of the entire magical and muggle world. When he skillfully stole the Elder Wand from the famous wandmaker Gregorovitch in 1899, it wasn't for personal power ambition or thirst for violence like his predecessors. Grindelwald had much bigger, more organized, and infinitely more dangerous plans for all humanity. He wanted to completely reshape the world order. With the Elder Wand finally in his talented hands, Grindelwald systematically built not just an empire, but an ideological revolution like the world had never seen. He wasn't a disorganized, sadistic killer like Deverell or a simple tyrant like Loxias. He was a brilliant revolutionary with an extremely dangerous but logically consistent philosophy. Grindelwald firmly believed that wizards should rule muggles, not out of cruelty or desire for domination, but for the greater good of all humanity. His logic was seductively simple. Wizards possessed power to solve all the world's problems: hunger, disease, war, poverty. It was morally wrong to allow muggles to continue suffering when wizards could create paradise on Earth. During decades of growing dominion, Grindelwald used the wand for conquests on a scale never seen before in history. He could perform magic that defied understanding, invoke devastating storms that destroyed entire cities, resurrect the dead as obedient soldiers in his ever-growing armies, and create magical defenses that entire armies of wizards couldn't even scratch. Even more dangerous, Grindelwald was a master of propaganda and psychological manipulation. He converted enemies into followers through demonstrations of his benevolent power. He healed incurable diseases to gain loyalty, resolved centuries-old conflicts with impressive demonstrations of magical justice, and gradually convinced entire communities that his vision was not only correct, but inevitable. What made Grindelwald even more dangerous was his deep personal connection with Albus Dumbledore. They had been not just childhood friends, but intellectual collaborators, and some whisper something even deeper. Together, they had developed the philosophy that Grindelwald would eventually take to the most terrible extremes. Dumbledore, tormented by guilt for having helped create the monster Grindelwald had become, initially refused to confront him directly. For years, he watched with growing horror while his former friend conquered entire countries, always hoping that Grindelwald would eventually realize the errors of his methods. Grindelwald's inevitable fall finally came in 1945, in a duel that scholars consider the greatest individual magical combat in modern history. It wasn't just a battle between two exceptionally powerful wizards. It was a confrontation between two fundamentally different philosophies about magic's role in the world. The final confrontation between Dumbledore and Grindelwald lasted several hours and literally destroyed half of a European city. Witnesses described magic being cast on scales that seemed to bend reality itself. The sky split with lightning of impossible colors. The earth trembled as if the world itself was in agony, and the very atmosphere seemed to scream with the power being released. Grindelwald fought with the Elder Wand as an extension of his own will, performing feats that no wizard before or after him managed to replicate. He literally rewrote local physics laws, created armies of shadow soldiers, and invoked magic that some believe was borrowed from dimensions beyond human comprehension. Dumbledore, in turn, fought without the world's most powerful wand, relying only on his own exceptional skill, and something Grindelwald had lost along his journey. The ability to fight motivated by love and protection of innocence, not by power or ideology. In the end, Dumbledore prevailed, not because he was magically superior, but because his motivation was pure. He fought to protect, while Grindelwald, despite his noble rationalizations, fought to dominate. The difference, however subtle, was decisive. When Grindelwald finally fell, defeated and exhausted, legend says he looked into Dumbledore's eyes and whispered, "You were always the better of us two, Albus." It was the belated recognition of a man who had lost his humanity in pursuit of what he believed to be the greater good. After the tragic and premature death of Cadmus Peverell, the Resurrection Stone mysteriously disappeared into the mists of history, taking with it the dark secrets of its creation and the echoes of pain that had consumed its creator. Unlike the Elder Wand, which left an obvious and bloody trail of violence wherever it went, the stone was infinitely more subtle in its methods of destruction. The stone possessed a magnetic aura that irresistibly attracted people who had lost precious loved ones. It was as if it could sense the pain of grief across impossible distances, whispering seductive promises of reunion to broken hearts. Invariably, those who succumbed to its temptation were driven to complete madness, deep depression that consumed their souls, or to suicide as the only escape from the torture of having their loved ones so close, but eternally out of reach. For centuries, the stone passed through countless hands, always leaving emotional destruction in its wake. Entire families were consumed by obsession with the dead. Small empires crumbled when their leaders became obsessed with talking to deceased ancestors. The stone didn't need physical violence. It destroyed through cruel hope and the illusion of possibility. The stone eventually came into the hands of the Gaunt family, direct and proud descendants of Salazar Slytherin, one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts. The Gaunts were a family that perfectly exemplified the decadence of ancient magical aristocracy, traditionally powerful and influential, but which had deteriorated through centuries of obsessive inbreeding and sickly fixation on blood purity. They transformed the mysterious stone into an ornate family ring, never realizing or fully understanding its true terrifying power. For the Gaunts, the ring was simply another symbol of their ancient greatness, a relic that connected their lineage directly to the great Salazar Slytherin. They instinctively knew it was deeply magical, but erroneously attributed its importance exclusively to their ancestral heritage. Marvolo Gaunt, the authoritarian patriarch of the family in the early 20th century, was a deeply bitter man who embodied all the tragedy of a noble family in terminal decline. He wore the ring as an obsessive status symbol, constantly boasting of his ancestral lineage to anyone who had the misfortune to cross his path. Marvolo's sickly obsession with blood purity and past greatness was a pathetic and desperate attempt to hide the devastating reality of his situation. He lived in absolutely squalid poverty in a crumbling shack that barely deserved the name of house. His clothes were patched and dirty, his food was scarce and of questionable quality, but he clung to symbols of past greatness like a shipwrecked survivor clings to debris. The ring with the resurrection stone subtly fed his obsession. Without consciously realizing it, Marvolo began to talk with dead ancestors during his lonely nights, believing they were simply vivid dreams or manifestations of his noble lineage. In reality, the stone was slowly corroding his connection with present reality, making him live increasingly in his family's glorious past. Morfin Gaunt, Marvolo's eldest son, inherited both the cursed ring and the growing hereditary madness of the family, amplified by the subtle but constant influence of the resurrection stone. He lived as a hermit, completely isolated from the civilized world, obsessively talking to snakes in Parseltongue, an ability he had inherited from Salazar Slytherin. The stone's influence on Morphin was particularly cruel. He began to see dead family members wandering the decadent property, especially during new moon nights. These encounters weren't comforting. The family spirits constantly reminded Morphin of his failure to maintain the lineage's purity and greatness, criticizing him for allowing the family to reach such a state of degradation. Morphin developed a pathological hatred for Muggles, violently attacking anyone who had the misfortune to approach his property. He sincerely believed he was defending sacred territory from contamination, when in reality he was simply being consumed by the same obsession that had destroyed his family for generations. The decadent life of the Gaunt family changed dramatically when Tom Riddle Sr., just a rich and extraordinarily attractive young Muggle, became tragically involved with Merope Gaunt, Marvolo's youngest and only daughter. This union would represent not only the final destruction of the Gaunt lineage, but the birth of the most dangerous dark wizard the world had ever known. Merope was a young witch of considerable ability, but completely destroyed by years of emotional and physical abuse at the hands of her father and brother. She had grown up believing she was ugly, incompetent, and unworthy of love, a self-fulfilling prophecy that isolated her even further from the outside world. When she first saw Tom Riddle Sr., an elegant young gentleman who represented everything she could never have, beauty, wealth, social acceptance, normalcy, Merope fell in love with the desperate intensity of someone who had never known genuine kindness. It was a love born from absolute deprivation, not from real affinity. Desperate and consumed by a passion she knew was impossible, Merope made a decision that would seal the fate of countless people. She used an extremely powerful love potion to seduce Tom Riddle Sr. and force him to fall in love with her. It was magic of the darkest kind, not because it was technically malevolent, but because it completely violated another human being's free will. The forced and artificial relationship resulted in the birth of Tom Marvolo Riddle, the future Lord Voldemort. But Merope, consumed by devastating guilt for having based her happiness on a magical lie, eventually couldn't bear the weight of her choice anymore. In a moment of terrible moral clarity, she stopped administering the love potion to her husband. Tom Riddle Sr. awoke from his trance as if waking from a nightmare. The realization that he had spent months living a life that wasn't his, married to a woman he didn't love, expecting a child he hadn't consciously desired, was too traumatic to bear. He abandoned Merope immediately, unable to process the shocking reality of his situation. Merope, now pregnant and completely alone, died during childbirth at Wool's orphanage in London. Her last words were a bitter curse against the Riddle name and an involuntary prophecy about the son she was bringing into the world. May he be stronger than his father. May he avenge the humiliations we have suffered. Without knowing it, Merope had condemned her son to grow up in a Muggle orphanage, without love, affection, or any connection to his magical origins, the perfect conditions to create a sociopath. Years later, young Tom Riddle had become an exceptionally intelligent teenager, charming on the surface, but deeply disturbed and dangerous underneath. When he discovered his magical origins and began investigating his family heritage, he methodically visited what remained of his decadent maternal family. What he found was Morphin Gaunt, living alone in absolute misery, still obsessively wearing the ancestral ring without understanding its true nature. Morphin was a broken man, consumed by decades of isolation and gradual madness, but still possessed fragmentary memories of family history. Tom Riddle, demonstrating from a young age the psychological manipulation that would make him famous, carefully extracted from Morphin the entire history of the ring and the family. He used a combination of supernatural charm, subtle legitimacy, and emotional manipulation to make Morphin relive and recount the Gaunt's past glories. That same fateful night, Tom Riddle executed a plan that had matured in his mind during months of careful planning. He visited the Riddle mansion and coldly murdered his Muggle father and paternal grandparents in a calculated revenge that was both personal and symbolic. The murders weren't committed from impulsive rage or uncontrolled emotion. They were precise executions, performed with curses that Riddle had learned during his secret studies of the dark arts. Each death was planned to send a message. He completely rejected his Muggle heritage and entirely embraced his magical nature, however dark it might be. Using advanced magic that few wizards his age could perform, Riddle completely altered Morphin's memories, implanting false recollections that made his uncle sincerely believe he had committed the murders in homicidal fury against Muggles. Morphin was arrested and died miserably in Azkaban, carrying guilt for crimes he hadn't committed. Riddle stole the ring without knowing it contained one of the 3 most powerful Deathly Hallows. For him, it was simply a valuable symbol of his noble heritage and a perfect tool for his future darker plans. Years later, Riddle, now proudly calling himself Lord Voldemort, transformed the ring into his second Horcrux in an absolutely horrible ceremony that forever stained both the stone and his own soul. The process was particularly dark because he specifically used the brutal murder of his father as emotional anchor to split and fragment his soul. The Resurrection Stone, already naturally imbued with powerful necromantic magic, became a perfect vessel for a fragment of the darkest and most corrupted soul of its generation. The combination of the stone's ancestral magic with Voldemort's pure evil created an object of almost indescribable power and malevolence. Voldemort carefully hid the ring in the Gaunt's ruined shack, protected by deadly curses that would instantly kill any unprepared intruder. Ironically, he didn't know he was zealously protecting one of the Deathly Hallows. For him, it was just a valuable symbol of his noble lineage and a safe container for part of his fragmented soul. Decades later, Albus Dumbledore discovered the ring's location during his meticulous investigations into Voldemort's Horcruxes. The search had consumed years of his life, involving research in ancient archives, interviews with survivors of Voldemort's atrocities, and careful analysis of patterns in his crimes. When Dumbledore finally penetrated the Gaunt Shack's defenses and saw the Deathly Hallows symbol engraved on the ancient stone, he was completely shocked and emotionally devastated. The great Albus Dumbledore, who had spent his entire adult life obsessively studying the Hallows legends, immediately realized what he had before him. What happened next was one of the most tragic and humanizing moments in the great Albus Dumbledore's life. Completely overcome by overwhelming emotion, by the impossible chance of reuniting with his beloved sister Ariana, dead for decades in a terrible duel between him, his brother Aberforth and Grindelwald, he temporarily forgot the caution that had always characterized him. Ariana had died young, victim of her own unstable magic and the conflict between those who loved her most. Dumbledore had carried the guilt of her death for decades, tormented by the possibility that his own spell had been responsible for taking her life. The chance to see her again, to ask forgiveness, to explain his choices, was too much temptation to resist. In a moment of purely human weakness, forgetting he was dealing not only with a Hallow, but with a Horcrux protected by the darkest curses Voldemort knew, Dumbledore put the ring on his finger without adequate precautions. Voldemort's deadly curses attacked immediately with devastating fury. Dumbledore's hand was instantly consumed by a necrotic curse that spread slowly through his body like deadly poison, corrupting and killing living tissue where it touched. Only his exceptional magical skill and Severus Snape's desperate intervention prevented his immediate death. Even so, the curse couldn't be completely removed, only delayed and temporarily contained. Dumbledore knew he had been condemned to a slow but inevitable death, the final price of a moment of all too human hope. The Invisibility Cloak had the most peaceful and harmonious fate of the three legendary Hallows, a direct reflection of its original creator's wisdom and benevolence. As Ignotus Peverell had been wise enough not to seek destructive power or domination over others, his precious relic was passed lovingly from generation to generation in a relatively harmonious and respectful manner. The Peverell family religiously maintained the sacred tradition established by Ignotus. The cloak would be passed to the eldest son on his deathbed, always accompanied by stories about its origin and wise advice about responsible use of its extraordinary power. Unlike the Elder Wand, which changed hands violently through murders and bloody betrayals, or the Resurrection Stone, which attracted tragedy and madness like a black magnet, the cloak simply remained, a constant and protective presence that faithfully served those who respected it. Each generation of Peverells added their own stories to the cloak's legend, but always following the principles established by Ignotus. Use power for protection, not domination. For preservation of life, not to take it. To escape danger, not to create it. It was a simple but profoundly wise philosophy that kept the cloak free from the curses that seemed to follow the other two Hallows. Around the 18th century, when the direct Peverell lineage was approaching its natural extinction, an event occurred that would change the cloak's destiny forever. Iolanthe Peverell, last legitimate descendant of the family, fell deeply in love with Hardwin Potter, a young wizard from an ancient and respected family. This historic union represented much more than a simple marriage for love. It united two of the oldest and noblest wizarding families in Britain, each with their own honorable traditions and contributions to the magical world. The Potters had always been known for their moral integrity, courage in the face of danger, and tendency to fight for the oppressed, qualities that aligned perfectly with the values that had protected the cloak for centuries. When Iolanthe brought the Invisibility Cloak to the Potter family, she found not just a new home, but a family that instinctively understood its true value. The Potters never tried to use the cloak to gain political influence, accumulate wealth, or dominate other wizards. Instead, they used it practically and altruistically for protection of their families during dangerous times, to escape threatening situations, or simply for privacy when necessary. Over the centuries, the Potters developed their own traditions around the cloak, always honoring its original principles. During times of war or persecution, the cloak was used to protect innocent wizards, help families escape persecution, or carry out dangerous rescue missions. During times of peace, it was passed respectfully from father to son, always accompanied by family stories and lessons about responsibility. Each Potter who inherited the cloak added their own stories of courage and protection. There were Potters who used it to save entire villages during wild dragon attacks, others who utilized it to rescue innocent prisoners from unjust magical prisons, some who simply used it to protect their families during difficult times, proving that not all heroism needs to be grandiose. Sometimes the greatest courage lies in silently protecting those we love. During the First Wizarding War, when Voldemort was at the height of his power and terror, James Potter used the cloak extensively as a dedicated and courageous member of the Order of the Phoenix. The supernatural ability to move completely invisible was crucial in several dangerous rescue and reconnaissance missions in territory controlled by Death Eaters. James wasn't just a skilled user of the cloak, he was a natural strategist who understood how to maximize its unique capabilities. He developed innovative combat techniques that combined total invisibility with precise attack spells, allowing him to neutralize entire groups of Death Eaters before they realized his presence. More importantly, James generously lent the cloak to other Order members when their missions required total invisibility. He never hoarded its power selfishly, or considered the cloak merely personal property. For him, it was a tool to be used in the fight against oppression and injustice, not a treasure to be protected in a vault. Lily Evans Potter, despite being Muggle-born, developed an intuitive and deep understanding of the cloak's true value that impressed even James. She perceived that the cloak's power didn't reside only in its ability to conceal, but in its capacity to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. During her years as an Order member, Lily used the cloak for humanitarian missions that others considered secondary, but which she knew were essential. Rescuing orphaned children from Death Eater attacks, protecting Muggle families who had been marked for extermination, and providing medical supplies to isolated magical communities that were suffering under Voldemort's reign of terror. Lily's influence on Potter tradition was subtle but profound. She brought an outside perspective that helped James see the cloak not just as family inheritance, but as moral responsibility. Together, they planned how the cloak would eventually be passed to Harry, always hoping he would grow up in an era of peace where its powers would be used for protection, not war. Ironically and tragically, James wasn't wearing the protective cloak on the fateful night of October 31st, 1981, when he and Lily were brutally murdered by Voldemort in Godric's Hollow. The cloak was carefully stored in safety, part of a careful plan by Dumbledore that James had agreed to follow. The decision not to use the cloak that night wasn't from negligence or forgetfulness. James and Lily had agreed with Dumbledore's plan that Harry would need to face Voldemort without external magical protections, so that his mother's sacrificial protective magic could work completely. It was an additional sacrifice. They gave up their own protection to ensure their son had the best possible chance of survival. The cloak waited patiently in the empty house, imbued with centuries of family love and protective traditions, waiting for the day it would be reunited with the last Potter, Harry, who would grow up without knowing his extraordinary inheritance until fate finally brought them together. After the tragic death of James and Lily, Albus Dumbledore assumed responsible custody of the invisibility cloak. This decision wasn't coincidence or administrative casualty. Dumbledore had spent decades intensively studying the legends of the Deathly Hallows, and he knew exactly what the cloak represented in the great tapestry of destiny that was unfolding. During Harry's first years at Hogwarts, Dumbledore occasionally used the cloak for his own secret investigations about Voldemort and the Horcruxes. Total invisibility was essential for some of his most dangerous research, allowing him to infiltrate places that would have been impossible to access otherwise. But Dumbledore always carefully planned to return the cloak to its rightful heir at the appropriate moment. The anonymous Christmas gift in Harry's first year was the first carefully calculated step in Dumbledore's greater plan to prepare young Potter for his extraordinary destiny. It was both a family inheritance gift and an essential tool for the adventures Dumbledore knew Harry would face. Dumbledore's decision to return the cloak to Harry in his first year at Hogwarts was strategic and deeply symbolic. Harry needed to rediscover his inheritance gradually, learn to responsibly use the extraordinary power he had inherited, and develop the character necessary to eventually resist the temptations of the other Hallows. During his years at Hogwarts, Harry used the cloak for countless nighttime adventures, dangerous investigations, and attempts to protect his friends. Each use taught him valuable lessons about responsibility, about when hiding was wise and when it was cowardly, about the difference between using power for protection versus using power for personal advantage. Dumbledore carefully observed how Harry used the cloak, satisfied to see that young Potter instinctively followed the same moral principles that had guided his family for centuries. Harry never used the cloak to harm innocents, to gain unfair academic advantages, or to feed his own ego. Instead, he used it to investigate mysteries, protect other students, and face dangers that adults didn't want him to face. Harry Potter grew up completely ignorant of his extraordinary ancestral heritage and the role he was destined to play in the millennial saga of the Deathly Hallows. For him, the invisibility cloak was simply a mysterious and useful gift that made his adventures at Hogwarts more exciting and his protection missions more effective. During his first 6 years at Hogwarts, Harry used the cloak hundreds of times without realizing he was carrying one of the most powerful and legendary objects in the entire magical world. It was ironic and deeply touching. The young man, who was destined to become the Master of Death, casually used one of the Deathly Hallows to escape from Filch in the corridors or investigate school mysteries. It was only in his 7th year, when Xenophilius Lovegood dramatically told him the complete legend of the Deathly Hallows, that Harry finally realized the absolute magnitude of what he possessed. The revelation was like lightning on a clear night, sudden, blinding, and completely transformative of his understanding about his own life and destiny. When Harry first saw the symbol of the Deathly Hallows, the triangle representing the cloak, the circle representing the stone, and the line representing the wand, it was as if pieces of a puzzle he didn't know he was assembling began to fit together. He had seen this symbol before, in Beedle, the Bard's book, in his mother's letter, engraved on ancient tombstones. The discovery was simultaneously exciting and terrifying. Harry realized he had spent years casually carrying one of the 3 most powerful objects in magical history, using it for trivial things like avoiding Filch or eavesdropping on conversations. More disturbing still, he understood that Voldemort possessed another of the Hallows, the Resurrection Stone, hidden in the Horcrux ring that Dumbledore had destroyed at a terrible cost. For an extremely dangerous period, Harry became completely obsessed with the Deathly Hallows. The seductive idea of possessing the 3 most powerful objects in the magical world consumed his thoughts day and night, transforming into an obsession that threatened to consume his own humanity. The logic that dominated his mind seemed irrefutable. If he could gather all 3 Hallows, he would truly be the Master of Death, as the legend promised. He could resurrect his dear parents and talk with them again. He could defeat Voldemort with absolute ease, using power that not even the Dark Lord could match. He would never lose anyone he loved again, because he would have power over death itself. This growing obsession almost cost the lives of his dearest friends. Harry completely neglected the search for the remaining Horcruxes, the mission Dumbledore had entrusted to him and which represented the only real way to defeat Voldemort. Instead, he obsessively focused on finding and gathering the Hallows, convinced they offered an easier and more powerful path to victory. Hermione Granger, always the voice of reason and prudence, repeatedly warned him about the mortal danger of this growing obsession. She could see Harry slowly transforming into something she didn't recognize. Someone consumed by thirst for power, someone who began to look dangerously like the very enemies they were fighting to defeat. "The Hallows are a distraction, Harry," she pleaded with tears in her eyes. "Dumbledore left a clear mission: find and destroy the Horcruxes. This obsession with the Hallows is leading us away from our true objective." But Harry was temporarily blinded by the tempting possibility of absolute power over death. He argued that the Hallows would make destroying the Horcruxes easier, safer, more certain. In reality, he was simply being seduced by the same temptation that had destroyed so many before him: the belief that enough power could solve all problems. Fate has a cruel and ironic sense of humor. Harry became the true master of the Elder Wand completely accidentally, without even realizing what had happened until much later. During the dramatic escape from Malfoy Manor, when he disarmed Draco Malfoy in a moment of absolute desperation, Harry inadvertently triggered the complex magical laws of wand loyalty. Draco had disarmed Dumbledore in the Astronomy Tower months before, technically becoming master of the Elder Wand, despite never having physically touched it. When Harry disarmed Draco, the wand's loyalty transferred to him through those same ancient and immutable laws. Voldemort, who had stolen the wand from Dumbledore's tomb with great ceremony and expectation, was never its true master. He was just an ignorant thief, someone who physically possessed the wand but never conquered its true loyalty. This fundamental difference would be absolutely crucial for the events that followed. The irony of the situation was almost poetic in its cruelty. Voldemort, who had spent decades seeking absolute power and believed he had finally found it in the Elder Wand, was destined to be defeated by his own ignorance about the laws that governed that power. Harry, on the other hand, who had become obsessed with the Hallows and dreamed of possessing the Elder Wand, was already its true master without knowing it. The universe had conspired to give him exactly what he thought he wanted, but in a way he had never expected or sought. During the final events at Hogwarts, when Voldemort used the Elder Wand to cast the killing curse against Harry in the Forbidden Forest, the wand, deeply reluctant to kill its true master. The deadly magic ricocheted violently, destroying the fragment of Voldemort's soul that had lodged parasitically in Harry, while miraculously preserving young Potter's life. In the Forbidden Forest, walking alone and courageously toward what he believed to be his certain and necessary death, Harry finally used the Resurrection Stone with tears silently streaming down his face. This moment represents one of the most emotionally powerful and spiritually profound points in the entire saga. The spectral and comforting shadows of his parents, Sirius Black and Remus Lupin, magically appeared around him, bringing indescribable comfort to a young man who was facing alone the most terrifying moment of his life. They weren't completely real, but they also weren't just illusions. They were something between the two worlds, love that transcended death itself. "Will you stay with me?" Harry asked, with his voice broken by emotion. "Until the very end," replied James Potter with a smile full of paternal pride. "And will it hurt?" Harry whispered, his courage finally wavering before the proximity of death. "Less than falling asleep," Sirius assured, with the gentleness that had always characterized his relationship with Harry. But Harry, unlike Cadmus Peverell centuries before, instinctively understood the stone's true, profound lesson. The dead should never permanently return to the world of the living. They belonged to the eternal rest they deserved. The Resurrection Stone didn't offer true reunion, only temporary comfort to help the living find courage to move forward. After receiving the emotional comfort and courage he desperately needed, the certainty that his loved ones loved him and were proud of him, Harry deliberately dropped the stone in the dark forest, losing it on purpose. He consciously chose to leave the dead in eternal peace, demonstrating emotional wisdom that went far beyond his years. This act of voluntary renunciation was perhaps the most mature and spiritually elevated moment of Harry's life. He possessed the power to keep his loved ones alive indefinitely, but understood that doing so would be cruel to both them and himself. True love sometimes requires letting go of those we love. The true narrative genius of the Deathly Hallows arc is that Harry became the master of death not through permanent possession of the three legendary objects, but through deep and spiritual understanding of when and how to voluntarily abandon them for love of others. For a few precious minutes during the final battle, Harry possessed all three Hallows simultaneously. The invisibility cloak he carried with him, the resurrection stone he had found in the golden snitch, and the elder wand that obeyed him through the laws of magical loyalty. He was, technically, the master of death that legend had promised. But those minutes were enough to teach him the most important lesson of his life. True power over death doesn't come from avoiding or controlling it, but from accepting it as a natural and necessary part of life. Mastery over death means living fully, loving deeply, and being willing to sacrifice one's own life to protect others. Immediately after the final battle, when the dust had settled and Voldemort was finally defeated, Harry made decisions that revealed his true character and hard-won wisdom. These choices contrasted dramatically with the decisions made by previous bearers of the Hallows, showing how Harry had grown and matured through his experiences. He deliberately broke the Elder Wand with his own holy wand and respectfully returned it to Dumbledore's tomb, ensuring its power could no longer tempt or corrupt future ambitious wizards. This decision required extraordinary willpower. He was voluntarily destroying the most powerful object in the magical world, something few wizards in history would have been able to do. He left the Resurrection Stone lost forever in the depths of the Forbidden Forest, ensuring no one else would be tempted by its cruel promises of reunion with the dead. He could have searched for and easily recovered it, but consciously chose to let it go. He kept only the Invisibility Cloak, which was legitimately his family inheritance and had been used for generations for protection, not domination. This choice honored both his ancestral lineage and the values he had learned through his experiences. The epic saga of the Deathly Hallows is, in its deepest essence, an extraordinarily sophisticated meditation on the human nature of power and our complex and inevitable relationship with mortality. Each Hallow represents a different and deeply human temptation to escape or control our own finitude. Temptations that echo through cultures and eras, speaking to universal fears and desires. The Elder Wand offers the seductive power to kill others before they kill us, the comforting illusion of safety through absolute domination. It's the temptation to resolve conflicts through superior force, to gain respect through fear, to protect oneself by becoming more dangerous than any potential threat. The Resurrection Stone offers the emotionally devastating fantasy of denying the reality of loss, of bringing beloved dead back, and continuing relationships that death interrupted. It's the temptation to refuse to accept that some things are beyond our control, that love sometimes means letting go of those we love. The Invisibility Cloak offers the ability to hide not only from external enemies, but from death itself, avoiding confrontation with our own mortality through literal and metaphorical concealment. It's the most subtle temptation, escaping life's responsibilities and consequences through literal and metaphorical invisibility. As the ancestral legend teaches with wisdom, accumulated through millennia of human experience, true mastery over death doesn't come from trying to avoid, control, or defeat it through power or magic. Instead, it comes from accepting it as a natural and necessary part of life, from living fully within the limitations it imposes, from finding meaning and purpose despite, or perhaps because of, our mortality. Ignotus Peverell became truly legendary, not for living forever or accumulating infinite power, but for living a full, meaningful, and morally consistent life, and for accepting his death when it naturally came time. He demonstrated that true victory over death isn't avoiding it, but facing it without fear when the appropriate moment arrived. Harry Potter learned this same lesson, but through painful personal experience instead of inherited wisdom. His journey through obsession with the Hallows, his moment of supreme sacrifice in the Forbidden Forest, and his final choices about what to do with the power he had conquered, all demonstrated his evolution from a young man who feared death to a man who understood it as an integral part of life. The Deathly Hallows shaped the magical world's history in ways few wizards realize or fully understand. Their influence extended far beyond individual bearers, affecting the course of wars, the rise and fall of magical civilizations, and the development of entire philosophies about power and morality. The Elder Wand caused more bloodshed than any other object in magical history. The wars fought for its possession, the empires built and destroyed through its power, and the countless murders committed in its name created waves that spread through centuries. Each time the wand changed hands violently, it left shattered families, devastated communities, and social scars that persisted for generations. The Resurrection Stone spread a more subtle but equally destructive form of suffering. The madness, depression, and despair it caused didn't affect only its direct bearers, but entire families that were consumed by obsession with the dead. Entire magical communities were sometimes infected by the melancholy that followed the stone, creating generations of wizards who lived more in the past than the present. The invisibility cloak, by contrast, represented a stabilizing force in magical history. The families that possessed it tended to be defenders of the oppressed, protectors of the innocent, and voices of moderation during times of extremism. Its influence was quieter but no less important. Countless lives were saved and injustices avoided through its responsible use. Voldemort's final defeat marked the symbolic end of the darkest era of the Deathly Hallows. With the Elder Wand respectfully returned to Dumbledore's tomb, the Resurrection Stone lost forever in the forest, and the invisibility cloak in the hands of someone finally wise enough to use its power responsibly, the magical world finally found the peace it had sought for centuries. For the first time in more than 1,000 years, the three Hallows no longer represented active threats to the magical world's stability. They had fulfilled their narrative and spiritual purpose, teaching through suffering the lessons humanity needed to learn about power, love, and acceptance of mortality. The geometric symbol of the Deathly Hallows, a triangle enclosing a circle cut by a vertical line, transcended its magical origins to become an icon of deep philosophical and spiritual meaning. It universally represented humanity's eternal search for power over others, for impossible connection with the lost, and for protection against the unknown and inevitable. Different groups throughout history interpreted the symbol in distinct ways, each seeing in it reflections of their own concerns and aspirations. For some, it represented the sacred trinity of power, love, and wisdom. For others, it symbolized the three aspects of the human condition: our capacity to affect the world, our need for emotional connection, and our fundamental vulnerability. Grindelwald adopted this symbol as the emblem of his bloody revolution, but he misunderstood its deeper meaning. For him, it represented brutal domination and magical supremacy over Muggles. Harry Potter, however, discovered its true meaning through direct experience and personal suffering, that true strength and wisdom come not from possessing absolute power, but from knowing when to voluntarily renounce it for others' good. The symbol became, for him, a reminder that the greatest victories sometimes require the greatest sacrifices. Even after decades of intensive study by wizard scholars and magical archaeologists, fascinating mysteries about the Hallows remain unanswered, fueling academic speculation and popular legends. These unresolved mysteries continue to intrigue researchers and add layers of complexity to the already rich mythology of the Hallows. No one knows with absolute certainty if other similar objects exist in other parts of the magical world. Ancient magical cultures from different continents speak of artifacts with suspiciously similar powers. The legendary soul-splitting blade in millennial Chinese traditions, the mysterious mirror of the dead in lost Aztec civilizations, the mythical shadow cloak used by ancestral Celtic druids. Some respected magical theorists speculate that the Deathly Hallows may be only three of a much larger set of objects created by the same civilization lost in the mists of prehistoric time. Others believe that objects of similar power arise naturally when exceptionally talented wizards attempt to transcend magic's natural limits through extreme means and terrible sacrifices. There are also more specific mysteries that remain unsolved. What exactly was the process used by Cadmus to create the Resurrection Stone? Why does the invisibility cloak maintain its eternal efficacy when other magical cloaks eventually fail? Is there any way to recreate the Elder Wand, or did its power depend on unique circumstances that cannot be replicated? With Harry Potter as responsible guardian of the invisibility cloak, the millennial tradition of the Peverils and Potters continues in safe and wise hands. It's highly likely that Harry will eventually pass the cloak to his children when the appropriate time comes, keeping alive the sacred lineage that began more than 1,000 years ago with Ignotus Peverell. The Elder Wand remains buried in Dumbledore's tomb, and we sincerely hope it remains there forever. Harry physically broke the wand before returning it, but some magic scholars speculate that a wand of such supernatural power cannot be truly destroyed by conventional methods, only temporarily dormant, patiently waiting for the moment to awaken again when the right conditions align. If these speculations are correct, the wand may eventually repair itself and begin a new cycle of temptation and violence. This terrifying possibility keeps some scholars awake at night, worried about what could happen if future generations forget the painfully learned lessons about the dangers of absolute power. The Resurrection Stone, lost in the mysterious depths of the Forbidden Forest, represents perhaps the greatest mystery of all. Is it still there, hidden among ancient roots and protected by the magical creatures that inhabit those shadowy lands? Was it found by some creature and further corrupted by its necromantic power? Or did it simply mystically dissolve back into the primordial elements that created it, finally freeing the world from its cruel influence? Some believe the forest itself will actively reject any attempt to find the stone, protecting the world from its rediscovery through ancestral magic that predates Hogwarts. Others speculate that the stone will eventually call another broken heart to itself, continuing its cycle of temptation and tragedy. And so, dear wizards and muggles, we reach the end of our epic and deeply emotional journey through the millennial history of the Deathly Hallows. This extraordinary saga, which extends from the mystical and talented Peverell brothers to Harry Potter, is much more than a simple legend about powerful magical objects. It's a timeless meditation on the human condition in all its complexity, our eternal search for power and control, our universal fear of loss and death, our deep desire to protect those we love, and our final capacity to grow, learn, and choose wisdom over power, love over domination, sacrifice over selfishness. The Deathly Hallows taught us lessons that echo through cultures and eras. Absolute power inevitably corrupts. The dead must rest in eternal peace. True protection comes from love and not from power, and accepting death is a fundamental part of fully accepting life. Harry Potter became truly powerful not when he possessed the world's most powerful objects, but when he had enough wisdom and courage to voluntarily renounce them. If you've made it this far, my deepest and sincere thanks for accompanying me on this extraordinary journey. I hope this deep analysis has touched your hearts the same way it touched mine while preparing this content. The story of the Deathly Hallows continues to move me each time I revisit it, revealing new layers of meaning and wisdom. Don't forget to leave your loving like. If this video touched you in some way, subscribe to the channel if you're not yet part of our magical family, and share with other passionate Harry Potter fans who deserve to know this incredible story. Tell me in the comments, if you had to choose one of the 3 Deathly Hallows, which would you choose and why? More importantly, would you have the courage to renounce it when the right moment came? Which moment from this epic saga most touched your hearts? I love reading and responding to each of your comments. They are true gifts to me. May the magic of the Deathly Hallows continue to inspire wisdom, courage, and love in all of us. May we learn from Harry Potter's choices and find the strength to make our own sacrifices when life calls us to protect those we love. Until our next magical adventure, and may the most powerful magic of all, unconditional love, always be with you.